So now, Ms. Ferguson, to talk about relief from parking requirements, Article 36.
What I just did. Oh, here we go. I'm Kristin Ferguson, 218 Thoreau Street. And if we're comparing square footage, ours is like 1,500 square feet.
Yep.
Four,
And you also have a dog.
four, terrible dog too.
Big dog.
Okay, so this article is about relief for parking requirements and some criteria that we are proposing to incorporate. If you recall, relief for parking is brought before the planning board if there's a change of use or increased use. That's kind of when it comes to us to evaluate whether we're going to recommend that relief for parking. And a lot of things are changing with parking and our evaluation of that. But for a while, we've been kind of informally considering 6 criteria, and we're going to talk about those and formalizing that as part of this change. So the 6 criteria that we have been using are, we want to see documentation from parking studies or transportation industry publications that show the parking ratios that are required for that in the zoning bylaw don't align with current industry standards. Again, if we don't need to pave everything, we don't need to park everywhere if things are changing in terms of our transportation needs. And so we would like our applicant to bring forward a current study that can show us give us some more specific information upon which we can make our recommendation. We also want to know how the proposed use is beneficial or contributes to other businesses, village center, and neighborhood when we evaluate, as well as the distance and availability of on-street parking, public parking, and alternative transportation. Again, these were things that we've been asking for, but they weren't formally criteria that applicants knew they had to be prepared to respond to. 3 more are information about the intensity of the use and the number of employees required, as well as alternative provisions for off-site parking for employees and the availability of convenient bicycle parking. In other words, these 6 things we've been asking about as applicants have come forward asking for parking relief since about June of 2016. We want to make sure that we establish these 6 criteria so that applicants know they've got to come forward with kind of specific information that we're going to be evaluating, and that gives the planning board more deliberate process for evaluating our recommendation for relief. And that's what we use. So we'll have this specific information, more formal information that the applicant will be prepared to provide, and we can incorporate that all into the recommendation to the Zoning Board of Appeals when granting relief for parking. So again, just a more informative way that we can make that recommendation. And also, we really would like applicants to be prepared to come forward with how they plan to incorporate alternative transportation options into the project. Again, hopefully not everybody has to drive to the site. Hopefully we're kind of moving away from that single car use. I will take any questions or comments. And if there are none, I'm going to continue to the next.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Excuse me.
At the mic.
Sorry
Yes,
about that.
that's okay.
Ruth Lauer, Kais Road. I think around slide 2 you mentioned industry standards. What industry are we talking about? Is it hospitality or
No, it's
alcohol
transportation industry
service?
standards.
I'm sorry?
Well, transportation industry publications that are creating standards for parking.
So the industry that we're talking about is transportation publication.
Yeah.
Does that have to be a local study, or can it be?
We don't specify, no.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Usually it could be a national study or something that can be extrapolated to the local level.
And then my next one, finally. If we are granting relief, that means we're giving away parking spaces. So I have to ask, how many parking spaces are there available that have not been assigned yet?
No, this
So-
is,
Yeah, so parking relief is when there's a use and there's a big table in our zoning bylaws that says, for this use, you need to have this many parking spaces.
Right.
So somebody would come to us and say, we'd like to change and have this use, or we're increasing our use, which requires us by your bylaw to have this many more parking spaces, but really we only have room for this many more parking spaces. So it's the delta, the difference between what our zoning bylaw requires and what they're saying they could do without kind of paving other stuff.
so just to give a specific example, You know, we have a proposal we were just looking at today for apartments to be built right on Commonwealth Ave in the center of West Concord. So our bylaw would say that you need 2 parking spaces per unit, but in that location, really 1 or 1.5 at the most would be necessary. So, but using these criteria, basically you could say, oh, well, if you're in a village center district, you don't need that full number of suburban quantity of parking spaces. And so therefore we'd say, yes, you can just have, you know, 1.5 spaces per unit instead of 2.
But then we have, say, the 100-space restaurant.
Yes.
Then the computation goes differently.
Yes, it does, but it's based upon the same kinds of criteria.
And those parking spaces have to come from somebody,
They do.
and that means...
And so they have to show where shared parking arrangements or off-site parking for employees or, you know, availability of public parking facilities, all of those things come into play in terms of how much relief can be granted.
So is it the first request that would trump all other requests in the pipeline? So say we're in Concord Center and there's somebody's planning a 100-seat restaurant and, you know, 4 or 5 shops over, there's another restaurant in the pipeline, maybe not 100 seats, but we'll need seats and, you know, we'll need parking for those seats. Is the decision case by case and they can be used up,
Well,
consumed?
Again, this is kind of where the applicant's going to need to bring us a local, you know, what they recommend locally and what they've studied, the distance and availability of on-street parking, what's available at what times, that it depends on the time of use and things like that. So it's all this information that we're asking them to formalize so that we can evaluate on a case-by-case basis.
And yes, they're handled in the order in which we hear them. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Ned Perry, 362 Bedford Street. I attended your hearing with the ZBA last summer, and there seemed to be a across-the-board disregard for parking requirements in applications. Comment was made that we're all successful, so that we have a parking issue, and that's great because we're a great town. I look at your criteria, and I wonder whether they're meaningful for you. I've watched applications go through in front of you and the ZBA over the last couple of years where parking studies have come in alleging parking spaces within half a mile, 10 minutes walking space. I didn't see anybody on either the ZBA or the planning board challenging or questioning any of that. Citizens questioned it and found that the walking distance was not accurate as stated, or the study was done on a Saturday when it was 3 degrees below zero and no one was out. I just wonder whether you have looked at the 6 criteria, whether they're meaningful to you, and whether you will, whether the ZBA, I guess in this instance, will actually apply them. And I hope that the planning board will also look at parking requirements. As I have more citizens coming to me and asking, I can't get to the bank anymore. I can't find parking behind the old post office. Where are we going? And I'm saying, well, that's the planning board, that's the ZBA. So I hope that you are taking these criteria seriously and that they are meaningful as you put them up on the board. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I can just speak to having been on the ZBA as well as the planning board over the period both before and after these criteria were put into place. We now have 4 years of experience of using these criteria, and I can tell you that they've been very helpful of giving us a more consistent process than what we had previously, which was kind of like, well, how do we feel? Do we feel like this needs, this is good or not? And so, and we have typically, as parking relief proposals have come in, ended up with basically concessions in the case of, for example, providing employee parking or providing bicycle racks or other kinds of alternative transportation options, contributions to Crosstown Connect, that actually I think have been effective. And that's why we felt that we would take what were up until now somewhat informal criteria that we use for our own evaluation purposes and put them into the bylaw itself. And that gives the applicant heads up in advance as to here's the kinds of criteria that you're going to need to answer to. So that's why we were after it.
Yeah, Ed Tiedemann, 656 Barrett's Mill Road. Could you go back to the previous slide? I think it was number 1. Yeah, I have this comment on documentation from parking studies, and we all know the old adage about statistics. And I keep thinking that the developer is always going to give you the statistics which show him in the best light for what he wants to do. And I would recommend that we do something like put the words like generally accepted parking studies, so that the developer cannot cherry pick his parking study. Thank you.
Henry Dane, 58 Everett Street. I've dealt with a lot of businesses that have tried to establish themselves in the business centers of town. The parking ratios can never be fulfilled because there are not enough parking spaces, and the only issue before the Board of Appeals or the Planning Board is not where do we get the parking from, it's just how many waivers do we grant. So the question is not you need 100 spaces, it's you don't need 50 spaces. What is needed is not more stringent and more burdensome parking requirements, but more parking.
Steve Carr, 308 Musselfield Road. Although I agree with Henry's point, my point is a much more minor one. In the text underneath the actual language, it says that this will require the applicant to provide a more informative basis for the request, et cetera, et cetera. The language, I would suggest, in the actual bylaw doesn't require the applicant to provide it. It says these are factors that are going to be considered. But if I'm the applicant, I could say, I don't know any great idea or knowledge about the availability of convenient bicycle. You guys, the board, go out and do that. So you might want to look at that language and see whether you can tighten it up.
The developer or the applicant doesn't have to provide information in each of these areas. They can provide this information, and it may help their application if they do.
And if
it's
they
not
don't,
relevant in every case. So, for example, someone that's looking for 2 spaces for 2 additional spaces because they're adding on to their business is probably not going to go out and fund a parking study. That but they might provide an alternative transportation option. So we're basically, the application will offer these as subjects that someone can answer.
Okay, so when the actual text of the bylaw says the determination shall include consideration of each of the
Our
following,
determination shall
it
include
really
that.
means if applicable, because it may not be applicable.
Well, I
is
mean,
what
we
you're saying.
will consider if this is blank that yes. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.